Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Financial Aid 101 for new counselors. My name is Faith Phillips, and I am the Director of Student Financial Services at Central Ohio Technical College and Ohio State Newark. This webinar is sponsored today by the Ohio Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. We are a nonprofit organization comprised of volunteer financial aid professionals. The OASFA Outreach Committee is the committee that serves as the primary resource for pertinent and current financial aid information. This committee disseminates this information through a variety of activities, including training programs for various stakeholders, including admission staff, high school counselors, access advisors, and TRIO. OASFA is happy to be able to provide this information to you as a free service. You have permission to copy and distribute these materials to your students and families. You may not charge your families for this material or the information presented. Permission must be granted for other use of this information or other materials. Please contact an OASFA outreach chairperson for information on how to disseminate and use this material. And you can reach us at outreach@oasfa.org. Financial Aid 101, this presentation draws on information from OASFA, NASFA, as well as federal student aid. Our webinar is an introduction to the financial aid process. For a more in-depth presentation and discussion, you are encouraged to attend the OASFA counselor workshops that are being offered virtually this October, November, and December, and registration is now open at oasfa.org. So let's get started. What is FAFSA and what is financial aid? The key word in FAFSA is free. The FAFSA is a standard free form that collects information about students and parents. The submission, again, of the FAFSA is free. So please caution your families not to pay for the submission of the FAFSA form or any scholarship applications. There are some paid websites out there, and oftentimes families do not know that they're on a paid website until they've gotten to the end of it and asked for a credit card. They should not be making any payments to submit the FAFSA form. Financial aid basically are funds that are provided to students and families to help them pay for the students' college educational expenses. The FAFSA collects information about the student and the parent and calculates out what we call the expected family contribution, or the EFC. In theory, it is what the federal government believes that the student and their parents combined should be able to contribute to the student's education, typically for a 9-month period of time. The EFC is based on taxable and untaxable income. And for the upcoming FAFSA form, so the FAFSA form that seniors in high school would file now, the FAFSA will be collecting the 2019 taxable and untaxable income and current assets of both the student and the parent. The EFC is also based on the family size, the number in college, as well as other demographic information, such as the marital status of the parents. Colleges then use that EFC to determine how much financial aid to offer to a student. The EFC stays the same regardless of where the student goes to college. So that ability to pay, that expected family contribution, stays the same. What changes, obviously, is the cost of attendance, depending on the type of institution that the student chooses to attend. The 21-22 academic year will open up the FAFSA on October the 1st. So for students that are seniors in high school, as well as continuing college students, the FAFSA that they will be filing starting October 1st is the 21-22 FAFSA form. Please remind your families that they will be submitting the application now for the student's freshman year, but that they must reapply for financial aid every year. So every October 1st, federal student aid releases the new year FAFSA form. The earlier that a student files their FAFSA, the earlier they may receive their financial aid offer and the more aid that they may be considered for. Many colleges and universities set what we call a FAFSA priority deadline, or a priority date, the date in which we want to encourage families to have their FAFSA submitted by, especially for incoming freshmen. Most colleges and universities will offer financial aid first to freshmen because we know that students are making decisions regarding enrollment early in the spring. So we want to get financial aid offers out to freshmen as early as possible. So the earlier a student files their FAFSA after October 1st, the earlier they may receive a financial aid package. The admissions process and the financial aid process at most colleges and universities are connected. And what I mean by that is many colleges will not look at a FAFSA if it doesn't have an admissions application to match up with it. So take, for example, at Ohio State, a student may file their FAFSA after October 1st and list Ohio State to receive the FAFSA, and it will be processed and sent to Ohio State. But we will not bring that FAFSA in until it has a financial aid, or excuse me, till it has an admissions application to match up with it. So if students are filing the FAFSA and listing a variety of colleges and expecting to see financial aid offers before they make decisions to enroll, the college may not look at that FAFSA until it has an admissions application to match up with it. That does not mean that the student has to have accepted admission or been offered admission to the college. The financial aid office, though, is looking for an admissions application to match up with it first. So how and when do we use these financial aid deadlines? So follow the FAFSA directions per college or university. You can go to most colleges' financial aid website and find out if they have a financial aid priority date, or simply call the financial aid office or the admissions office and ask, what is your financial aid priority date for the FAFSA? And tell families to make sure that they have the FAFSA submitted by the school that has the earliest date. At OASFA, we are in the process of doing a survey of all Ohio colleges, and we will very soon have out an updated FAFSA priority deadline survey on our OASFA website. There is one out there now. It's for the current award year, but you can refer families to this, or you can go and obtain it, the survey, and you can help families determine what priority dates Ohio schools are listing. The FAFSA form is the only application that a student needs to complete to apply for federal and state financial aid. However, some colleges do require additional financial aid applications, and one of the most common ones is the CSS profile form. And that is used by some private schools primarily because the additional form goes deeper into the family's financial circumstances, and they can only use that for institutional financial aid. They cannot bypass what the FAFSA says for determining the student's eligibility for federal and state aid. They have to use the FAFSA form. So a student should verify with each of the colleges and universities where they are applying if there are any other financial aid forms that they need to complete besides the FAFSA form. Need analysis is the calculation of the expected family contribution, so the actual process of processing the FAFSA form. The philosophy of the federal government is that parents have the primary responsibility to pay for their dependent child's education to the extent that they are able. They also feel that students have a responsibility to contribute to their educational costs, which is why the student's information as well as the parents' information is required on the FAFSA form. The other philosophy is that families should be evaluated in their present financial condition. And so when the student files the 21-22 FAFSA, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, families will report their 2019 taxable and untaxable income. Federal student aid believes that that is the best way to capture the family's present financial condition, is using the tax return that was filed in 2019, so a completed taxable and untaxable picture or capture of the family's financial strength. However, we do recognize that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, families' financial picture has probably changed in many cases from 2019 to 2020. And so financial aid offices recognize this, and it may necessitate us to use more professional judgment. And we will talk about professional judgment in special circumstances later on in this presentation. A family's ability to pay for educational costs must be evaluated equitably and consistently. And again, recognize that special circumstances can exist and could affect a family's ability to pay. So what is the EFC? There are two components. There's a student contribution and a parent contribution. And we look at the income and assets of the student, if they have any, as well as the income and assets of the parent, if the student is a dependent student for financial aid purposes. The EFC, again, is the amount that the family can reasonably be expected to contribute to the student's education. It is not what they owe the college. So some families see that expected family contribution when the FAFSA is processed and think that that's what they owe the colleges that they're having the FAFSA sent to, and that is not the case. It is an index or a figure then that we use in the financial aid office to determine how much aid we can offer that student. Keep in mind that the federal formula does not measure willingness to pay. It is looking at what we believe is their ability to be able to pay. As I mentioned earlier, the EFC stays the same regardless of the college. And a calculated EFC is a federal formula that is based on, again, information provided on the FAFSA form. So we will use the terms interchangeably: cost of attendance, EFC, and financial need. And so you'll hear them, financial aid staff say, well, the student doesn't have financial need, or they're packaged to their financial need. So what does that mean? So the colleges and universities are required to put together each year an estimated cost of attendance for the college for the academic year. And we take that cost of attendance, we subtract what that expected family contribution is, and that helps us determine how much need-based aid we can offer to a student. That cost of attendance is made up of direct cost and indirect cost. So the direct costs are typically what the student pays directly to the colleges and universities. So tuition and fees, as well as room and board. And then we also must include those indirect costs. So transportation, whether that's going back and forth as a commuter student, or if they're living on campus, the transportation cost to go home occasionally, as well as miscellaneous and personal expenses. So the whole cost of attendance isn't just the tuition and fees and room and board, it's also clothing and entertainment and miscellaneous expenses. And then we must also include a component for books and supplies, which is usually at most schools not a direct cost, meaning it is not billed through the school, it's an indirect cost. So here is an example of 3 different types of institutions. You can see at a higher cost institution, the cost of attendance is $58,000. You can see the EFC, expected family contribution, doesn't change regardless of where the student goes to school. But what does change is the need, the unmet need at each of these institutions. So let's talk about filing the FAFSA form. There are a couple different ways in which a family can submit their FAFSA form. Most families will use the FAFSA on the web, the desktop version of the FAFSA. There is a paper application that a family can obtain where they fill it out on paper and mail it to the federal processor. Very few families use paper anymore. It is much slower and also can cause mistakes. If a family makes a mistake, it takes a while to get that corrected. So more than 97% of the population completes their FAFSA by using the FAFSA on the web. There are mobile apps as well as My Student Aid app. We encourage the use of the FAFSA on the web because it has built-in edits to help families prevent from making costly errors. So for example, if they say that the student's date of birth is July 15th of 2020, the FAFSA on the web knows that that's an illogical response, and it will pop up a message and ask them to check the date. It also has skip logic built into it. So based on how a student or parent answers a certain question, it allows them to skip unnecessary questions. So if the student says that they are female, it will not present that student with the information about selective service. And if the parent says that they are single, it will only look for income for one parent. So it doesn't make the student or the parent answer questions that they don't need to answer. Also, by using FAFSA on the web, the families have an option to use what is called the IRS data retrieval tool, where it allows them to temporarily leave the FAFSA form and go over to the IRS and bring over their 2019 taxable income and plugs it right back into the FAFSA for them. So it saves them data entry time as well as the opportunity to make a mistake in their data entry. More timely submission, of course, by doing the FAFSA on the web. If they submit the FAFSA with electronic signatures, it is usually processed within 48 to 72 hours and sent to the colleges and universities listed on the form. The FAFSA on the web has more detailed instruction and help available than a paper application does. So if a family is in the question in the answer box, there's the opportunity to click for detailed instructions. And the process gets easier each year for the family. So remember, they have to reapply for financial aid every year. So for the first year, it takes a little bit more time because they're going to enter in more demographic information about the student. Next year, when they reapply, they will identify the student and it will pre-populate the demographic information that typically doesn't change. They can update it if it did. Otherwise, they can disregard it, move on, and update it with the current tax information and assets. The first step that we want you to encourage your families to do first is request an FSA ID, which does become the electronic signature for the FAFSA form as well as other FSA products. The student and the parent each need their own individual FSA IDs, and they go to fsaid.ed.gov and click on Create an FSA ID. Enter their personal information, their mailing address, email, phone, language preference, answer their challenge questions, and then they create their own user ID and password for all FSA websites. Parents and students may not use the same mobile phone or the same email address. So once the first person has created their FSA ID and uses the mobile phone and an email address, it will not allow them to use that again on another account. We also discourage students from using their high school or college email accounts, as those tend to be deactivated upon graduation. Only one parent whose information goes on the FAFSA form has to have an FSA ID. So if parents are married, only one of the parents needs to have an FSA ID, and they will use their same FSA ID for all of their students that will be applying for financial aid. So take my family, for example. There's a family of 4, myself, my husband, and 2 children. This coming year, I will have 2 children in college. I have an FSA ID, and each of my children will have to have their own FAFSA, and they will each have their own FSA ID. And even though my husband's information goes on the FAFSA for each of them, he does not need an FSA ID to sign the FAFSA. The FSA ID is used again for FAFSA completion as well as access to other certain Department of Education websites. Only the owner should create their FSA ID. So each student should create their own and each parent should create their own. And when possible, verify the email and mobile phone number using the secure code that's provided. So when they provide an email address, it will ask if they want to confirm it, and it will send a code to that email address that they will type back in. And then they do the same thing for the mobile phone. So encourage families to do that. It's just one more measure of access for the student and the parent to their FSA ID. The FSA ID is not year specific, so students and parents can create those now. They do not have to wait until October 1st, and we do encourage them to get the FSA ID prior to going into the FAFSA website. So FAFSA on the web, this is the home page, and it is at FAFSA.gov, and the .gov is the key to make sure that you're not on a paid FAFSA website. So families will go to this, and they will click on Apply for Aid. And if they are new to the FAFSA process, so submitting the information for the very first time, they will click Start Here. And then every time after that, after they've identified the student with their user ID and password, then they will log in each time. Frequent FAFSA errors that we see families make is filing the wrong FAFSA year. So when a family goes in, if they were to go into FAFSA.gov today, there would only be one FAFSA out there. That is the 2020-2021 FAFSA that our current enrolled students are using for financial aid for this academic year. On October 1st, the two FAFSA years will be out there, the 2021 and the 21-22 FAFSA. So you will want to make sure that you stress to your families that the FAFSA they are filing is the 21-22 FAFSA form. We will often have students file the wrong year and want to know why they didn't receive a financial aid offer, and that's because they filed the year that we are currently in. Make sure that students are using their legal name exactly as it appears on their Social Security card. When the FAFSA is processed, it goes to the Social Security Administration database, and it makes sure that the student matches in the database by name, Social Security number, and date of birth. So we don't want families using nicknames on the FSA ID or on the FAFSA form. We already talked about financial aid deadlines, but making sure that they pay attention to those FAFSA priority dates, getting the FAFSA submitted by the dates that the colleges want to maximize their aid eligibility, as well as how quickly they will receive an award notification. But also, if we request additional information from the student, they will want to pay attention to any deadlines that are put into the request for additional information. Of course, making sure that you don't transpose digits or insert extra digits. You would imagine what would happen if you add an extra zero to your adjusted gross income, how that would elevate the family's expected family contribution. So we just want to make sure that families are taking the time to double check and make sure that they've entered their data correctly. Again, using the correct Social Security number and date of birth, and submitting the wrong parent's financial information or not including a step parent's information. So if parents aren't quite sure, there's a great document in the Getting Started for the FAFSA that tells the student and the parent who the parent is that should be filing the FAFSA form. What untaxed income to report. As I said, the FAFSA does a really good job of explaining what is being requested, and those untaxed income questions are very confusing. So if a family would read the explanation, it will tell them exactly where to go on their tax return or on their W-2 to figure out what income needs to be reported on the FAFSA form. We also find family members will include the wrong number in the household or perhaps the number in college. And again, what to include in investments or net worth. On the FAFSA form, a student can list up to 10 colleges and universities that they want the FAFSA sent to. If you're working with students that are looking at more than 10 colleges, they're really up in the air or not quite sure, they can submit the FAFSA form, make sure that they're choosing the schools that have the earliest financial aid priority dates on the first submission of their FAFSA. Submit the FAFSA, wait the 48 to 72 hours processing time. They will receive an email that says their FAFSA has been processed, and they can now log back into the FAFSA, go to the school selection section, and they can add 10 more colleges and universities and resubmit that FAFSA. When they do that, it does not tell all of the first 10 colleges and universities that they've been bumped off or that the FAFSA has gone to another school. It just is a clean FAFSA that then goes to the next colleges that they have listed there. Also, schools cannot see what order they've been listed in the institutional section. So if a student listed 4 colleges, when it reaches OSU or COTC, I can only see my institution on their FAFSA form. I do not see what other schools were listed, and I do not see what order I was listed. Some students would be worried about, if I wasn't listed number 1 for Ohio State, will they consider me for as much financial aid? We cannot see that information. When they are listing their colleges in the FAFSA form, there is a school comparison button that they can click, and it will give them an idea based on the school that they listed, what the tuition and fees are, what the net price is, their graduation rate. So it's a really good source for students if they're not quite sure. They've heard of this school, but they don't know a whole lot about it. It will give them more information. But we also encourage you to send your families to the College Navigator website, which will give them a lot of information about all of the colleges that they are considering. So when a family has entered in all of their information on the FAFSA form, they will provide electronic signature, which is that FSA ID. Please, please, please remind them to actually submit the FAFSA. So when they log into FAFSA.gov and they start typing in their information on the FAFSA form, it is saved on a secured website, and colleges cannot access that information until the student has actually submitted it. So the students need to make sure that they click the Submit My FAFSA Now button. That is how the FAFSA knows to be sent to the colleges that they have listed on the FAFSA website. If a family realizes that they have made a mistake after they have submitted the FAFSA form, again, they have to wait the 48 to 72 hour processing time before they can log back in and make any corrections. But after that, they can log in and correct any mistakes that they may have made. Please warn them that if they go in and make any corrections to anything other than, say, the address or phone number or email, the school will very likely ask them to explain and document why they made those changes. Students and parents cannot update assets and savings after they've submitted the FAFSA form. So the taxable and untaxable income is captured based on 2019 information, but the assets and the cash savings and checking amount are captured as of the date that the student submits the FAFSA form. So if families know that they have, a couple extra $1,000 in their savings account that is meant to be used to pay off a bill, they will want to make sure that they've paid off that bill before they enter the information on the FAFSA form, so that they can honestly say that on this date, this is what I had in my assets and my cash savings and checking. Once they submit the FAFSA, that information is not updatable because that could be changing on a daily basis. And then, of course, they can add more schools at any point in time during the FAFSA year. So sometimes students will list, one school that they know for sure that they're going to go to. They enroll, they attend fall semester, and sometimes students change their minds and they come back home or they attend a different college or university. At any time during the FAFSA year, the student can go out and add more schools to their FAFSA form. Also, corrections may be made by submitting the documentation directly to the financial aid office. So sometimes I will be talking to a student that we discover that they made a mistake, and I already know that we will request documentation of it. I will just tell the student to submit the documentation to us directly, and we, the college, can make the correction for them on the FAFSA form. So let's talk about special circumstances, especially this coming year. We will see a lot of families reaching out to us to explain that they have special circumstances. So special circumstances are conditions that exist that cannot be documented on the FAFSA form. So families cannot make adjustments themselves on the FAFSA form to reflect their current financial information. They have to submit the FAFSA form using the 2019 taxable and untaxable income and their income and assets, or excuse me, their assets and cash and savings at the time that they submit the FAFSA form. Most colleges have an appeal process to address special circumstances, and the college can review and request additional information as necessary. If the student's circumstances are warranted, so the financial aid administrator determines that yes, indeed, their circumstances could make a difference in their financial aid eligibility, the financial aid administrator will submit corrections to the FAFSA to reflect those changes. And then we flag something in the FAFSA that tells the federal processor the FAFSA was originally processed with the current information, but we, the financial aid administrator, are overriding that information and doing a special circumstance or using our professional judgment. Each college may have a different way of reviewing these special circumstances. So if you're dealing with seniors right now and you're starting to talk to them about the FAFSA process, the FAFSA comes out October 1st. Yes, we recognize that it's asking for 2019 taxable and untaxable income, and they are telling you that their 2020 income has decreased. They need to get that FAFSA submitted as directed starting October 1st, and then they will need to reach out to all the college's financial aid offices where they are applying to discuss their special circumstances. Most colleges will not start looking at special circumstances until the middle part of spring semester. So we start receiving the FAFSAs in October, November, and December. And we are just now setting up our systems for next year. And so some schools will start bringing those FAFSAs in, and some may start making financial aid offers in November and December. But the bulk of your financial aid offices will not start communicating with students probably until January or February. It won't be until about February or March that most schools are ready to look at special circumstances. So we want to get the FAFSAs in with the data as provided. Then we will start preparing our appeal forms and putting those out on our financial aid web pages. So many students can start monitoring financial aid web pages in February and March. And under their forms section is where most of us will put our appeal forms. And a student may be applying to 3 different schools and get 3 different appeal forms, and they probably will look similar, but they will be slightly different. And so if they are still making decisions about what schools to attend, they will want to do that appeal form at all of the colleges that they have applied to. The schools will then review their information, consider whether or not that makes a difference in their aid eligibility. The goal obviously is to reduce that expected family contribution and make the student eligible for more aid. And again, if the school determines that they are eligible for more aid, they will make the corrections to the FAFSA for the student. The decision that the college makes is final and cannot be appealed to the Department of Education. These are examples of some of the special circumstances that colleges will take into consideration. The largest one, obviously, being loss of employment. That's the one we deal with the most. And colleges are expecting this to increase, as I said, going into 21-22 with the pandemic in 2020. Another common one that we see is students appealing because of loss of child support. So child support tends to end when a student turns 18 or graduates high school. But when they file the FAFSA after October 1st, they will list the child support that they received, that the parent received in 2019. So that is something that the financial aid office could take into consideration if the student provides documentation that child support ended or will be ending on a certain date. We could recalculate the FAFSA and see if that changes the EFC. Also, unusual medical or dental expenses that are not covered by insurance. So if a family in 2018 or 2020 had expenses that they had to pay for out of pocket, they could contact the financial aid office and do an appeal, show the expenses after insurance was covered, and if the school determines that that could make a difference, we will go in and in most cases reduce the adjusted gross income reported based on those unusual medical or dental expenses. Unfortunately, family circumstances change. So when the FAFSA is filed, parents are married, and after the FAFSA is filed, perhaps they separate, or a parent passes away, or the parents get divorced. The family would want to reach out to the financial aid office and explain that their circumstances changed, and again, allow the financial aid office to determine if that would make a difference in their eligibility. When the FAFSA is processed, it goes to the central processor for processing, and then the information is sent to the colleges and universities. Federal student aid will select a certain percentage of the FAFSA forms that it reviews and require the college to complete a process called verification. Basically, we're just confirming that the family filed the FAFSA properly. It is not an accusation of providing false information, and some families think we are picking on them. It is basically just an audit of random FAFSAs to make sure that the information was put into the FAFSA correctly and that financial aid is getting to the right students. Roughly 22% of all FAFSAs last year were selected for verification. So FSA can select the student, but also colleges have the responsibility to carefully review the FAFSAs. And if there's something that feels like it might be conflicting on the FAFSA form, the school has the authority to also select the student for financial aid. Or excuse me, for verification. So if the student has been selected for verification, the college will reach out to the student and let them know they've been selected, and they will tell them exactly what is required in order to complete the verification process. The 2 most common documents that we request from students is a verification worksheet, which will look different across colleges and universities. But in general, what we're seeking is the student lists just a number in household and a number in college. So to verify that that number is correct, we will ask them to spell out for us who is in the household. So by name and relationship to the student. So that's how we verify that the household number and the number in college is correct. And then the other common verification item is to make sure that the family reported their taxable and untaxable income correctly. And so we will ask them for a copy of their federal tax return from 2019 or a copy of the federal tax return transcript. Now, within the FAFSA, as I mentioned earlier, families have the opportunity to use the IRS data retrieval tool, which allows them again to go over to the IRS and plug in their taxable income onto the FAFSA. If a family is selected for verification and they successfully completed using the IRS data retrieval tool, we will not have to ask them for a copy of their tax return or tax transcript. That is considered already verified when it was plugged in directly from the IRS. Occasionally, we do ask for W-2s for parents and students who reported that they worked in 2019, but they did not file taxes. And occasionally we have to request a verification of non-filing letter for parents and independent students only. So if a parent or an independent student says that they did not file taxes for 2019, some of those FAFSAs are selected for verification of that. So just to make sure that they didn't file, and if they didn't, that they weren't required to, they will have to reach out to the IRS and provide to us a non-filing letter that confirms that they didn't file and they were not required to file. There are some other verification items that we may request from the student, but these are the most common ones. So it's important that the student pays attention to any additional requests for information after the FAFSA has been reviewed by the financial aid office, just to make sure that we keep moving forward in that financial aid review process and making sure that we get those financial aid offers out to a student as quickly as possible. Again, the federal income tax return is an acceptable form of documentation of their federal income taxes, and it has to be signed. This includes a signed copy of the return and amended, if they amended their tax return and if they were victims of identity theft. If the family did not retain a copy of their federal income tax return, they can request what's called an IRS tax return transcript directly from the IRS by going to the website or calling the 1-800 number. So once the FAFSAs are processed, as I said, the information is sent from FSA directly to all of the colleges and universities that the student listed on the FAFSA form. We begin to review those FAFSAs, reach out to the students and let them know if we need additional verification documents. And then once the financial aid FAFSA form and our review is complete, we will then determine how much financial aid to offer the student. Financial aid offers may be mailed to a student or they may be emailed. It just depends on the college's process. A lot of private schools, for example, have nice brochures that they send a whole packet of information out to the student via US mail. Some schools will send an email to the student and say, your financial aid has been offered. Log into our school portal and you will be able to see your financial aid offer. And then each offer may look different from college to college. So the financial aid offers are dictated a little bit by federal student aid. We're told what we have to include, but the look and feel of those can be different from each college. And it can become confusing for students to lay down 3 different financial aid offers and fully understand what each college and university is offering to them. The offer will, at a minimum, include what cost of attendance the college used and the EFC that was used to determine their financial aid offer. It will tell them exactly how much financial aid they've been offered from each program. So we typically show them what they're being offered for the full academic year, and then we break it out in terms. And then usually that will be an autumn semester and a spring semester so that they don't get confused and see the annual offer and think that that's what's available to them, for example, autumn semester. We also are required to provide them an explanation of how and when is that aid dispersed. So in most cases, a student has to register for classes, they have to have a bill generated, and then their financial aid for the term will be applied to their student account. And so an explanation of how and when aid is dispersed to their account should somewhere be provided to them on that financial aid offer. And then we will reference that there are terms and conditions of that offer. So the student is responsible for understanding what they had to do in order to be eligible to receive the financial aid, and in order what they have to do to keep that financial aid offer, and that is the student's responsibility. Many of those financial aid offers that are put out on our student portals will direct the student to our financial aid website or portal with an entire page full of their rights and responsibilities regarding the financial aid process. Sources of financial aid include the federal government, which is filing the FAFSA form. That is how a student applies for federal financial aid. And then the state of Ohio has financial aid, scholarship, and grant programs. And the only application that they need initially is that FAFSA form for the state of Ohio aid. We'll talk in a minute about the different types of state aid. Then the colleges and universities have their own financial aid. And in many cases, a student won't be eligible for institutional financial aid if they have not submitted that FAFSA form. Also, a family's employers. So encouraging your parents to talk to their employers about any type of tuition benefit that may be available to them, or are there any scholarship programs that their dependent children may apply for. And then, of course, private sources. So those community scholarships that the information goes to the high school counselors to make available to their students. Looking at a library, any other organizations that a student may be involved in are great resources for private scholarships and opportunities. There are basically three different types of categories of financial aid. There's the gift aid that the student doesn't have to pay back. So the grants and scholarships, the scholarships that are usually need-based. There's the self-help aid. Some require a FAFSA, some don't, but we always encourage families to file that FAFSA form. But loans are considered self-help aid because the student has to pay those back, typically after they have graduated or ceased to be enrolled at least half time. Veterans educational benefits or work-study jobs where they would work on campus and earn a paycheck and use that to contribute toward their college education expenses. And then merit-based scholarships, scholarships that are typically awarded to a student based on their academic performance and not necessarily based on any type of financial need. Please caution your families to be aware of scholarship scams. Don't provide a credit card when applying for scholarships. You shouldn't have to pay for that information. So if they're doing research out on the web, have them apply for any scholarships that do not ask them to pay a fee or do not ask them to provide confidential information such as their social security numbers. Also pursuing those local scholarships, checking with the colleges and universities. Not only do we offer our own scholarships, but many of us have on our websites those external scholarships. We receive information from outside companies that tell us about their scholarships. Many of us will put those out on our websites for students to apply for. And then using reputable scholarship search engines, and here is one that the U.S. Department of Education recommends. So Ohio aid programs. So the state of Ohio, as I mentioned, has their own scholarships and grant programs. And in most cases, filing the FAFSA is what the student has to do to be considered for these. The Ohio War Orphan Scholarship, the National Guard, the Safety Officers Memorial Fund, the Nursing Education Loan Program, and the Choose Ohio First Scholarships. All of those also have an application process that the student needs to complete, and they can access those applications off of the state of Ohio, the Ohio Department of Higher Education's webpage. But the OCOG, the Ohio College Opportunity Grant, the application for that is through the FAFSA form, and by indicating that the student is an Ohio resident, that gives permission for the FAFSA to be sent to Ohio Department of Higher Education to evaluate the student's eligibility for OCOG. And based on the schools that are listed on the FAFSA form, that will allow ODHE to communicate with those colleges whether or not the student is eligible to receive OCOG. The deadline for the FAFSA for the 21-22 year is the student has to have a FAFSA on file by October 1st of 2021. As long as they attend an eligible Ohio institution or a Pennsylvania institution, they would be able to receive the OCOG if their EFC is less than or equal to 2190 and their maximum household income is $96,000. There is a maximum time period in which the student may receive OCOG, and that is 10 semesters or 15 quarters of enrollment. The 2021 award chart is here. So you can see that at community colleges and regional campuses, in most cases, students, even if they have the accurate EFC range and the income range, they are not eligible to receive OCOG at community colleges and regional campuses. And the theory behind that is our tuition is lower, and the EFC the Pell Grant that would be generated by the EFC that would make them OCOG eligible would give them enough money to cover tuition and fees in most cases at a community college or a regional campus. The exception to that are foster youth students. If they complete what is called the ETV form, they may be eligible to receive OCOG at a community college or a regional campus. Federal Work Study is available to undergraduate and graduate students who are eligible, but they must file the FAFSA form. Employment can be available to students on or off campus. Now, this current academic year, Federal Work Study is looking a little bit different simply because not all colleges are 100% open yet. And so it's unfortunate that our students that were awarded Federal Work Study this current year may not be able to use their Federal Work Study offers completely simply because some of our campus offices are just not open, or we're limiting the number of staff that can work there, so we're not hiring as many work study students. But hopefully by 21-22, we'll be back to normal world, and those students will be able to take advantage of their federal work study offers. And the benefit to the work study program is any of the wages that a student earns under work study would get reported initially on their FAFSA form because it'll be a part of their taxable income. However, it becomes excluded also on the FAFSA form. So any federal work study earnings that a student has does not count against their financial aid eligibility in the future. Eligible employers would be the school itself, schools that participate with outside agencies, private nonprofit or for-profit organizations, or community service opportunities. So depending on the college's federal work study policies, a student has a lot of opportunities on where they can work. And the benefit to working on campus, obviously, is that they can go to class sometimes for a couple hours, go work in an office for a couple hours, and then go back to class. Whereas if a student works off campus, they typically have to finish their educational activities on campus and then go to work. And supervisors tend to be a little bit more flexible with the student's schedule when they're working on campus versus out off of campus. Many times that FAFSA priority deadline date that was discussed earlier would drive the student's eligibility for work study. So making sure that students know when those priority dates are and getting that FAFSA submitted in a timely manner so that they can be offered federal work study. Federal Pell Grant is a federal grant that is awarded to the neediest students, and it is awarded based on the student's expected family contribution. So if a student has a 0 expected family contribution, they will receive the maximum amount of Pell, and this $6,345 is the maximum amount of Pell eligibility for the current academic year. It has been going up a little bit each academic year. And then a student with an EFC of 5576 could still be eligible for Pell Grant. The minimum is $639. But students whose EFC goes larger than this 5576 will not be eligible for federal Pell Grant. So that federal Pell Grant does go to our most needy students. Then most colleges and universities participate in the federal SEOG grant program, which is another campus-based program that is also driven by that financial aid priority date. So federal work study and federal SEOG are limited pots of money allocated by federal student aid to the colleges and universities. And so those funds tend to go quickly, and they go to students who meet those priority deadline dates. SEOG is awarded to students that demonstrate the most exceptional financial need. Typically, it goes to Pell eligible students, and typically it goes to those students with the lowest EFC. And while FSA tells us that the award ranges for SEOG could be anywhere from $100 to $4,000 per year, the typical award is usually between $100 and $500 per semester. And it varies again from college to college, but because that fund is so limited, we try to offer it to as many students as we can. So if I were to offer a $4,000 annual award to students, I would touch very few students. And so most of us will go with a smaller award so that we can make offers to a larger number of students. Then there are student loans. Student loans are borrowed directly from the federal government. For students, there is not a credit check. They do not have to have demonstrated income in order to take out the loans. Parents can also borrow loans in their name on behalf of their dependent children, but there is a credit check for those loans. Students should only borrow what is really needed. So even though the college offers them a student loan, the student does not have to accept that loan if they do not really need it. So if they have enough grants and other financial support, they can just disregard the financial aid offer and not accept it. However, loans are a great investment in the student's future, and if they have to borrow while they're in school, it is not the worst debt for a student to have. In order to apply for a student loan, a student must file the FAFSA form and then review their financial aid offer from the schools to learn about their eligibility for student loans. The students will be required to complete what is called entrance counseling, where they read about their rights and responsibilities as a borrower, and they are required to sign a master promissory note. They will use that FSA ID that they created for their FAFSA form to complete these two steps. And then if the parent chooses to borrow a parent loan, they too will have to complete a parent loan application, and they'll have to sign a master prom note using their FSA ID. If families are struggling with questions on the FAFSA form or with their FSA ID, you can always refer them to FSA, and here is their phone number and what was their availability, agents availability. I think that changed a little bit during COVID, but I believe that they're back to their normal hours. If students have very specific questions, though, please direct them to a financial aid office to ask their questions, just because we want to make sure that they're getting the proper answers to their questions. The OASFA Outreach Committee can help you facilitate financial aid nights. We do know that those look different this year. We know most of you cannot have presenters come onto your schools to present the financial aid information, but if you need a financial aid presenter, whether it's virtual or in person, please go to the OASFA website under Counselor Resources and request a financial aid night presenter. We are also in the process of recording a financial aid presentation, what we call a financial aid night, that will soon be put out under Counselor Resources, that you can link to your webpage, and you can also send out to your families and let them know that while you can't put a financial aid presenter in the school in person for them, this is a recorded financial aid night. It will be generic financial aid information, very similar to this presentation, that you can share with your families. So if you're still in the planning stages of what your financial aid night will look like, we can do virtual, we can do an in-person if you want an in-person, or again, we'll have a recorded version for you to use. If you have any questions at any time, please reach out to the Outreach Committee at our email address, outreach@oasfa.org. Also, please make sure that you put your name and your email address in our College Access and School Counselor contact database, so that we can make sure, as training opportunities become available and other information that we feel is pertinent to you, we can get that information out to you. We do have a web page that is just for counselors out on oasfa.org. Again, that is where you will request your high school night presenter. Register for those counselor workshops that I mentioned. Again, registration is live. It is a virtual workshop. I believe we're offering 2 in October, 2 in November, and 1 in December. And so sign up for that, those counselor workshops. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to listen to this webinar. I hope this information was helpful to you. We will plan in the spring to provide an FA 102 webinar for you, and we will send out that information once we have that scheduled. Again, thank you and have a great day.